I'm glad and honored to open this panel on Vignettes of modern Shia communities in the Arab world. My name is Meir Litvak. I'm from Tel Aviv University. I will be the discussant in this panel. We have four promising scholars. I will introduce each one of them at the beginning of the presentation. Our first speaker is Dr. Aymenn Jawad al-Tamimi, who is a research fellow at the Middle Eastern Forum. He's a graduate of Oxford University with a Bachelor of Classics and Oriental Studies, and from what I've heard, he's been translating from Greek, Latin, Spanish, Hebrew, and other languages. And he has also been a prolific writer on various issues on the Middle East, and he will speak on the Syrian civil war and the Shia villages of al-Fua and al-Kafariya in Syria. So, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be speaking at this panel. I did this paper actually on the two Syrian Shia villages of al-Fua and Kafariya, which are located in Idlib province in the far northwest of Syria near the border with Turkey. Because there's been a lot of literature about the Syrian civil war. You can find some general narrative accounts in the literature, like Charles Lister's The Syrian Jihad, Kevin Mazur's Revolution in Syria, which focused on the first 2 years. And you've also seen a lot of specific studies about insurgent factions, the Islamic State angle, look how many books there are about the Islamic State. I did feel there was a gap in the literature about specific specific Shia, 12er Syrian Shia communities in the country and specific studies about them. And so the basis actually of my presentation actually is a memoir which was written by the man who headed the crisis management committee in the two villages when they were being besieged by the insurgents between 2015 and 2018, after which they've been completely evacuated their original inhabitants. The memoir is on the table, and I do have copies for sale if you are interested in purchasing it. But it forms the foundation of this paper I presented for this conference. But it's not just a regurgitation of this the contents of the memoir. Rather, I've used the memoir and triangulated with other sources, like conducting interviews with other people from those two villages, people on the insurgent side during the civil war, some outside observers as well who might have had some knowledge of the events that were going on during this period. So I just give you some basic facts, firstly, about al-Fua Kafariya. As I mentioned, they're in the northwest of Syria, near the border with Turkey. And you can see the population statistics. So al-Fua is the larger of the two villages. It's administratively classified in the Syrian state classification as being a town, whereas Kafariya will be classed as a municipality or a belder. But there was one other Shia community as well within this Idlib province, in a town called Ma'arat Misrin, which is just north of these two villages. But that is actually a Sunni town mostly, and only had a small Shia minority of 2,500 individuals or so before the war. Just to also be clear, this in the bigger picture, these villages, they form an isolated pocket of 12er Shiism in the region. But it's not that these communities are recent converts to Shiism. I mean, there was before the war in Syria a phenomenon, and there has been since the war as well, a phenomenon of people converting to 12er Shia Islam. For example, in the Aleppo area among Baggara tribesmen and other parts of Syria. But in this northwest pocket here, it's for all intents and purposes an indigenous Shia population, and it goes back many, many generations. For example, actually, there's a 14th century historian called Ibn al-Wardi who mentioned a certain sheikh from al-Fua, Muhanna al-Fu'i, And he says that he praises him because he was guided, whereas he had been born in an environment that was not on the right path, meaning that he had converted to Sunni Islam from Shi'ism. Probably the presence of Shia, 12er Shia in the region ultimately goes back to the Hamdanid dynasty of 12er Shia who ruled that part of what is now northern Syria. And probably at some point, as you can also see from Ibn al-Wardi's testimony in the 14th century, that Shi'ism was probably a bit more widespread in terms of the spread over the localities than it was in, say, 2010. But as I say, for all intents and purposes, it was indigenous. Next slide, please. To give a bit of an account of looking at the memoir and also some other lines of testimony. So essentially, you have these two Shia villages surrounded by Sunni villages and towns, and also a bit further north as well, you had some Druze villages, which are all also indigenous. By various accounts that people give, that generally the relations between these villages, as they portray it as being positive before the war. So, for example, they mention the Muhammad Hassan Taqi, the writer of the memoir. He mentions that in al-Fua they used to have a celebration of the Prophet's birthday every year, and they would invite people from Idlib and elsewhere from various sects, including the Sunnis, to come and celebrate and try to find some point of commonality. I did also speak to a person from Karbala, which is one of the Druze villages in further north, and he also did mention he had many friends from al-Fua before the war, but he's since lost contact with them because they've all been evacuated from that area. So this is a photo from 2008 of these celebrations of the Prophet's birthday. Next slide, please. But then looking at 2011 to 2012, when we look at what happened there in that period, you saw all of these protests that, of course, were part of this wider wave, what has been called the Arab Spring. It certainly is the case that when you look at grievances that were being articulated in 2011, 2012, you look at a lot of YouTube videos and accounts from the time, and this has actually been brought up in a previous panel about how a lot of recent history has to rely on social media. It is fair to say there wasn't necessarily a massively sectarian feel to those protests, because many of the grievances that were articulated were pretty similar to grievances elsewhere in the region. But what I would say, actually, looking at what happened, is that it became a de facto sectarian because of the political divide in that the people of al-Fua and Kafariya, in general, they chose to side with the government, and whatever sympathy they might have had with specific demands about, say, reform, they considered the idea of changing the regime to be unacceptable, and that they saw as harboring a sinister agenda. In contrast, all the neighboring towns, Sunni towns, surrounding al-Fua and Kafariya, became hubs for revolutionary sentiment. In terms of reasons for people in al-Fua and Kafariya supporting the government, I think it's a combination of both material factors and also, to an extent, ideological factors, in that Syria was seen as part of the resistance axis, and the communities, even before the war, they sympathized with the concept of the resistance axis, and Syria as being a key node of hub of support for Hezbollah, and for, there's great admiration for Hassan Nasrallah, for example, among the people of al-Fua and Kafariya. But also other issues that are a bit more materialistic, like the fact that the state was a provider of jobs, a concern about potentially just total chaos erupting from this situation. And during this period also, you see the formation of various popular committees with government support. And this is one of the first manifestations of pro-government auxiliary formations alongside the Syrian army. In the early period, of course, these popular committees, they have been armed by the government, And at the same time, within the same period also, you're witnessing quite an early militarization of the insurgency, particularly in the Idlib area, for example, where in a nearby town called Jisr al-Shughur in 2011, various insurgents massacred around over 100 personnel from the Syrian military intelligence. That's not to say the government didn't respond violently as well to demonstrations, but I'm just saying there's this escalating spiral going on both sides. And within that period also, you see, even so, despite this escalating situation, there were these attempts at a more local level to achieve what's so-called conciliation, where the local Ba'ath Party, for example, and other members of the Syrian state, and also members of both communities in al-Fua and Kafariya and particularly in the town of Binish to the south of al-Fua. They tried to arrange these local conciliations. On the Binish side, they involve people who also still maintain some links to the Syrian state. But all of these failed because it's basically a question of not addressing the bigger picture. You can call for conciliation and say, al-Fua and Binish are brotherly towns, and we're one. But they didn't really address the fact that really the Binish was as a hub for revolutionary sentiment, while al-Fua and Kafariya are hubs for the government loyalist sentiment. Next slide, please. No. Previous slide, please. Yeah. Over the course of late 2012, with the continued militarization, development of the insurgency, and just this descent into all-out civil war, the popular committees in al-Fua and Kafariya, in conjunction with popular committees elsewhere in the country, they're organized into more formal formations. Of course, one of the most prominent ones that came to wider media attention during the war was the National Defense Forces. But contrary to what some people say, they weren't affiliated directly with Hezbollah or the Revolutionary Guard. But rather, Hezbollah and the Revolutionary Guard helped to set up the wider network, but they weren't affiliated with it. Only a minority, actually, of the fighters in al-Fua and Kafariya become part of this National Defense Forces network. Most of them, actually, they get... you see Lebanese Hezbollah personnel arrive into al-Fua and Kafariya in around late 2012 and early 2013, and they help organize these fighters mostly into a single Hezbollah-affiliated military formation. They call it in Arabic a Tashkil al-Askari. And at this stage, what they're trying to do, you have a partial siege stage, to use the words of Mohammed Hassan Taqi, the writer of the memoir, in that most of the towns by this point surrounding al-Fua and Kafariya are under insurgent control, and there is only a narrow route connecting to Idlib city. And the fighters in al-Fua and Kafariya help to control this route, to keep hold of it, and the insurgents are trying to take it to cut the route, but also to make it easier to attack Idlib city. And there's much more of a sectarian feel to this conflict, because now, by this point, you see much more of overt involvement of Hezbollah and other Shia fighters who portray the conflict in religious terms, and you also see the rise of jihadists on the other side of the conflict, particularly Islamic State and al-Qaeda and Salafis. They become much more prominent. Next slide, please. This is just a map, al-Fua and Kafariya in the green, and this is the narrow route they're holding to Idlib city. Next slide, please. This guy actually, he was killed. This is just an interesting add-on. This guy, he was killed quite recently by the Israelis in the strike on Dahiya in Beirut. Al-Hajdul Fiqar, I don't know his real name, but he was actually involved in the training and formation of the popular committees into this Hezbollah-affiliated military formation in al-Fua and Kafariya. Next slide, please. Then, actually, the insurgency in 2015, they organized their efforts and they formed this Jaish al-Fatah coalition, or army of conquest, that takes over Idlib city and most of the province, and they cut the routes from al-Fua and Kafariya. So basically, you then just have this situation where the two villages are stuck in this isolation, surrounded in this sea of insurgent-controlled territory. And they're under total siege. And the main forces defending it are the Hezbollah-affiliated formation and the National Defense Forces. So the insurgents have some leverage over the government, effectively, now, and over Hezbollah as well. And to try to get a counter-pressure mechanism, and I'm not saying this is the only reason this happened, but the Syrian army and Hezbollah launched an offensive and besieged Zabadani and Madaya and tightened the grip on it. Again, I'm not saying this is the only reason for this, but it was one of the reasons to get a counter-leverage over the insurgents. And eventually this sets the basis for negotiating what's called the Four Towns Agreement, that is then for mutual evacuations on both sides. And it takes its final form in March 2017, once it becomes clear the Syrian army and its allies are going to retake Zabadani and Madaya. And there's probably some kind of intention eventually just to evacuate all the people of al-Fua and Kafariya. Next slide, please. So at the same time as the battles, there are a bunch of battles that take place in the summer of 2015 where the insurgents are trying to just tighten the pressure even more on the government and Hezbollah to get them to negotiate. But at the same time also, those battles mostly stop by September of 2015, but you still see a lot of mortars and sniper attacks. Next slide, please. This is an image they post about conducting prayers in the mosque even as the mortars are falling. This is in al-Fua. Next slide, please. This is Sheikh Mohammed Hassan Taqi, who wrote the memoir after coming out of Eid prayers in al-Fua. Next slide, please. Again, to round off quickly, I won't be too long on this, I promise. But in the meantime, between 2015 and 2018, there is this total siege on the two villages. And you have a crisis management committee that's headed by Taqi to try to deal with this siege situation. It also included two members of Hezbollah on the crisis management committee, Al-Haj Sadiq and Haj Sayyid Abu Hamza. And here are just some various methods they do to try to deal with the problems posed by the siege. So there were Red Crescent deliveries as part of the ceasefire agreement. There was also smuggling in of goods. But the most important method, actually, was that the Crisis Management Committee would coordinate with the committee in Damascus to arrange with the Iranians and Syrian government to deliver goods and by airdrop from helicopter over 4,000 meters. I think this in general helped to prevent total starvation, mass starvation in the two towns, but it was still a pretty bad humanitarian situation, and you had other problems of general malnutrition, a hepatitis epidemic in 2016, familial separation and mental health issues through the separation of families. Next slide, please. As a side note, one of the key Hezbollah personnel in this situation was Jamil Faqih, who helped organize the fighters. He was actually killed by smugglers in Kafariya because Hezbollah tried to stop the smuggling, tried to crack down on the smuggling of goods into the two localities. Next slide. This guy was recently killed by Israel, and his father was, I mentioned, was on the Crisis Management Committee. Next slide. The certificate of thanks, and you see the signatures of people in the Crisis Management Committee. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, now actually trying to round off. We have an eventual evacuation in July of 2018, where for various reasons, such as demands from within to just get out and reunite with families, weariness, lack of ammunition, the overwhelming military superiority of the insurgents, just means that then a final evacuation is negotiated in 2018, and all the remaining inhabitants who leave are distributed between various areas. Just to be clear, though, none actually went to Zabadani and Madaya. But, next slide, please. Now, with al-Fua and Kafariya completely evacuated, Sunni insurgent factions took over all the property in al-Fua and Kafariya, and now they've been resettled with Sunni IDPs from elsewhere in Syria and also some foreign fighters. And now al-Fua and Kafariya have just effectively become Sunni towns, and this is likely to be a permanent demographic shift unless you have a political resolution to the Syrian civil war or the area is recaptured by the Syrian government. And last slide to conclude, these are examples of the new Sunni presence in al-Fua and Kafariya since the evacuation. You have a whole community of people from Zabadani who have settled in al-Fua, and there's even a restaurant called Gates of Zebedani in al-Fua. So I'll end on that note, and thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Rachel Kantz who is a senior researcher at the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. And Rachel has written her PhD at Tel Aviv University under the supervision of Professor Menashri and myself on Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. And today, Rachel will speak about Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr and the struggle for Martyr's Day in post-2003 Iraq. So, Rachel, please.
Hi. So today I want to discuss two of what I argue are the primary factors that help explain the fact that to date, since the US-led invasion in 2003, Iraq does not have a formally recognized Martyrs' Day in its official national calendar. Now, the first factor that has precluded the designation of Martyrs' Day in Iraq relates to the intra-Shia competition surrounding the memory and legacy of Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. And as Mayor noted, I've spent a lot of time studying him, so it pains me to describe him here in 3 clauses. But Sadr was one of the most influential Shia clerics and intellectuals of the 20th century. And he was executed by Saddam in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution. Today's contemporary Shi'a political forces in Iraq all sort of trace their lineage back to him and try to derive their legitimacy from their proximity to him. Now, the second factor that I believe explains the inability to designate an official day of remembrance relates to competing narratives of the Iran-Iraq war in post-2003 Iraq. So for this presentation, I want to discuss these 2 factors in tandem and chronologically. So I'll first briefly describe what Martyrs' Day looked like under Saddam, then I'll detail the initial unsuccessful efforts to commemorate the legacy of Sadr and Iraq's martyrs together in a national holiday. And I'll also address the role of the Muhassasat al-Shuhada, or the Martyrs Foundation, and also the impact of ISIS and the rise of the Hashd al-Shabi, the popular mobilization forces, on what is really this fundamental question of how to define who is an Iraqi martyr. It's pretty hard to overstate the extent to which representation of the Iran-Iraq war's meanings, symbolism, narratives of martyrdom are at the heart of political and cultural discourses in both Iran and Iraq. Processes linked to the nationalization of death and ascribing meaning to the war were and remain central to Iranian and Iraqi official narratives and collective memory since the war's outbreak. In January 1982, the Ba'athist Revolutionary Command Council designated December 1st as Martyrs' Day, and this was to mark the day in which Iranian forces executed Iraqi prisoners of war. And the date was chosen to underscore the contravention by the Iranian government, in the words of the Ba'athist directive, of, quote, international, moral, and religious laws and injunctions. This date allowed for the construction of martyrdom around the twin themes of heroism and victimhood. And actually, the Ba'ath regime forged consensus amongst most Iraqis on the question of sacrifice for the nation. Iraqi soldiers were martyrs protecting Arab Iraq from Persian-Iranian aggression. Now, the depersonalization of death and the enlistment of Shia clerics to legitimize sacrifice for the nation within a narrow Islamic frame and alongside themes of Arab dignity and honor and Iraqi sovereignty all contributed to this establishment of such consensus. And just to point it out, one manifestation of this consensus is evident in a related but separate issue I don't have time to get into, and that's the fate of the Nusb al-Shahid, or the Martyrs Monument, which is one of the only remaining architectural symbols from Saddam's era that remains in post-2003 Iraq. Now moving to 2003 and this entanglement of the commemoration of Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr in the quest for Iraq's Martyrs' Day, we find that the need to define what Sadr means to post-Ba'athist Iraq and the question of how to commemorate him collided with some of the earliest and most contentious political and cultural debates related to Iraq's national reconciliation. How and why is that the case? Well, the iconic images of the statue of Saddam Hussein being torn down in central Baghdad that sort of symbolize the end, even before Saddam was caught, but the end of his regime, that occurred on April 9th, which was the same day that Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr was executed by the Ba'ath regime in 1980. So with al-Sadr thrust to sort of the center stage of these narratives of self-sacrifice, what happened is the first major intra-Shi'i politicized cultural struggle in post-2003 Iraq erupted. This coincidence of dates was initially embraced by Shi'i leaders and other mainstream parties that comprised the Iraqi Governing Council, the IGC, the provisional government. And in July 2003, at the conclusion of the first IGC meeting, 2 resolutions related to the symbolic de-Baathification supported commemorating Sadr's martyrdom in a national holiday. The first resolution simply canceled all official holidays associated with Saddam. And the second resolution stated, quote, April 9th, the day the regime fell, shall become a national day for Iraq and an official holiday, something that has not happened. The Iraqi press reported that the IGC debated celebrating both Martyrs' Day and Iraqi Independence Day together on April 9th, also, which didn't happen. And the decision by the Governing Council to designate April 9th without presenting it to the parliament first or the public was critiqued sharply. But most crucially, Muqtada al-Sadr, the nephew of Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, rejected the date, arguing that the regime did not fall on that day, but Iraq was occupied. Over the years, Muqtada al-Sadr would come to embrace the coincidence of dates and boast that Sadr's martyrdom was actually the beginning of the struggle against tyranny. But in the early days of the occupation, he asserted an Iraqi nationalist, anti-imperialist argument for his decision to reject the opportunity to center the leadership and martyrdom of Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, his uncle, and his father, Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, in a main national holiday for Iraq. He didn't have time to reconsider because the following month, Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim, who was the leader of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, one of the organizations that's most closely associated with the Iranian regime and seen as a proxy by many, he was assassinated, and that immediately rendered him a primary contender to kind of symbolize the Iraqi martyr and Iraqi Shi'ism more broadly. But Hakim had been accused of participating in such torture and killing of Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq War. And he had incensed Iraqis when he publicly discussed the need to abolish December 1st in solidarity with Iran. I think he said, our brothers in Iran. So there was public outrage at his statement, and it really just reflected how his campaign, the campaign launched by his office, his family office, to elevate him and commemorate Iraq's Martyrs' Day on the date that he was martyred, it would really entail a stark and inflammatory contrast from marking Martyrs' Day on December 1st under Saddam, which again was not just propaganda. There's excellent research showing that it was that there was an authentic consensus around that date. And this sort of was channeling the rage and sorrow into the Arab and Persian ethnic divide. And by elevating Hakim, it would be commemorating the founding leader of an organization that's viewed as a perpetrator of war crimes against Iraqis themselves and as a proxy of Iran. Now, I don't have time to get into this, but whereas in exile, when the Shia opposition, Iraqi Shia opposition, went to exile in Iran, The Hakim family worked hard to center their identity on their proximity and links to Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. But in 2003, they would need to de-emphasize and attempted to sort of dislodge Sadr from the centrality of martyrdom, and this is, of course, in order to elevate Hakim. All right, I want to turn, actually, really just 5 minutes? I want to turn to an important vehicle, an arena of competition for the efforts to forge consensus on Martyrs' Day, and that's the Martyrs Foundation. In January 2006, a law was passed to establish the Martyrs Foundation, which is a governmental office tied to the Prime Minister's office, and is mandated to define the Iraqi martyr, compensate the martyrs' families, and memorialize their sacrifices. Now, it's important to emphasize that the difficulty in identifying a date for Martyrs' Day, one that's palatable to all Iraqis, is germane to the legal delineation of Iraq's martyr and the legacy of the Iran-Iraq War. The 2006 law narrowly defined the martyr as every Iraqi citizen who lost his life because of its opposition to the past regime. This excluded martyrs of the Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War, and the victims of the US-led invasion. It offered no narrative of Iraqi sacrifice for the nation. Iraqis with secular, non-sectarian political leanings, as well as others who sympathized with Sunni opposition parties, objected to the exclusion of the Iran-Iraq war martyrs. Furthermore, over the years, politicized implementation and politicized work of the Martyrs Foundation engendered widespread resentment towards the foundation itself among the public. So this law didn't specify a day commemoration, nor did the 2009 amendment. And in the absence of a state-administered Martyrs' Day, Iraq witnessed a proliferation of days of remembrance over the years, from the Iraqi Communist Party's Day, Kurdish parties, and even practices at the local provincial level. And it would be observed unevenly throughout Iraq. In a reflection of this state of affairs, in 2012, the Martyrs Foundation featured a plea directly to the Iraqi parliament titled, "When Will We Announce Martyrs' Day?" Eventually, by 2013, informal commemorations for Iraq's Martyrs' Day would start to take place on the 1st of Rajab, which was the day that martyr Hakim was assassinated. So we see that Hakim is this emblem of the Iraqi martyr, and elevating him to the status that awards him the honor to be commemorated in Iraq's Martyrs' Day. It was a slow and informal and incomplete process, but still somewhat established by 2013. And this brings us to the issue of the emergence of ISIS and its impact. Before ISIS captured global attention, Iraqis had been calling to render the legal recognition of missing persons as martyrs, to do so more inclusively and equalize privileges between the categories of missing persons. And the continued exclusion of some of the categories of fallen Iraqis and perceptions of the foundation's dysfunction and corruption and sectarianism continued to breed outrage. So just before the emergence of ISIS, there was work within the parliamentary groups to advance an amendment that would address these grievances. In November 2015, the parliament passed the Martyrs Foundation Law No. 2, promulgated in 2016, and it recognized the Hashd al-Shabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces, as martyrs, and actually established a Bureau of Martyrs specifically for the Popular Mobilization Forces within the Martyrs Foundation. So whereas the 2005 Constitution defined the martyr narrowly but clearly as the victim of the Ba'ath regime, subsequent amendments and laws regulating the categories started to do so more expansively. But still, the pieces of legislation were not integrated and sometimes even inconsistent, and the institutional framework for recognizing, compensating, and honoring families of martyrs didn't provide a single coherent definition of the Iraqi martyr. 2 minutes, maybe? Okay. So Amr al-Hakim, the nephew of the martyred Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim, he emerged as a vocal and consistent critic of the status quo and generally critiqued the work of the Martyrs Foundation. In his weekly cultural forum in April 2015, he launched a scathing attack on the foundation. He appealed to the House of Representatives, quote, to avoid a state of double standards and to work in the spirit of one Iraq with all of its sacrifices. He asked, have we reached a time in which martyrdom is divided among different institutions and sects? He went as far as to declare that all Iraqis who fell in Iraq's conflicts should be recognized. Now, for his part, this is worthwhile. I'll just take 1 second. Just months after the 2016 Martyrs Foundation law was passed, something interesting happened, another coincidence. The 1st of Rajab fell on April 9th. This created a total lack of clarity on what and whom were being recognized and commemorated before the Iraqi public. And again, Hakim, he tried to promote an inclusive Martyrs' Day. I will skip over some of the ways he tried to reassociate his family with the line and legacy of Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. Unlike his uncle who tried to dislodge Sadr, he now reunited his family's relationship with Sadr in his attempt to render the notion of the Iraqi martyr more inclusive. Okay. All right, there are plenty of facets here that I don't have time to address, but this coincidence, this sort of triple coincidence of Hakim's 1st of Rajab date falling on April 9th, the day the regime fell, the day Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr was assassinated, it really evoked a lot of pain amongst the Iraqis, because in the media we had op-eds from Sunnis and Shi'i columnists alike lamenting the extent of perceived Iranian penetration and control of Iraq. Some argued that Iranian interference in Iraq is so pervasive that it exceeds political and military interference, and they took this coincidence of dates and commemoration to extrapolate and infer that the Iranian intentions are to obliterate the Arab identity of Iraq. Others asked, has Shi'ism become the national doctrine of Iraq? And many urged Iraqis to remember that the Iran-Iraq war was a national Arab war in defense of Arabs. Again, there are some things I'll skip over. I'll just conclude with the notion that each year, when December comes and when April comes, December 1st and early April, each year, these political and cultural debates reemerge in the press. We see them. And to this day, due to both the intra-Shi'i competition and the contested legacies of the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq remains bereft of a unified state-administered memory of Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, and it lacks a basic acceptable definition of who and what circumstances of death renders one an Iraqi martyr. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Alexander Morse Shepard, who is a PhD student or candidate at the Indiana University, who's also gotten his MA degree at Indiana University, and he is writing his PhD on Shia Islam and Iran, and he will speak about religious and national identity for the Saudi Shia, democracy and secessionism. So, please.
Just gotta time myself to make sure stay within the mark. Let's see, here's well, thank you all for coming to this panel, and thank you especially to the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa for accepting and hosting this wonderful conference and panel. And of course, thank you to all my co-panelists and to Dr. Litvak for serving as our discussant. feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Yes, my paper concerns the identity as a result of the ongoing issues of facing the Saudi Shia community in eastern Saudi Arabia. It concerns the oppression they have faced under the hands of the current Saudi regime, as well as some of their attempts to navigate their identities and deal with the results of this oppression. This includes the creation of their own distinct identity, which is on both religious as well as along arguably racial lines, as well as their complicated relationship to the standard bearer, or the self-proclaimed standard bearers of Shia Islam, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and how they've perceived themselves in relation to the outreach programs of Khomeini and Khamenei to serve as under some kind of pan-Shiite project. Now, a couple things to note is that, as it's referenced in the title, is that Saudi Shiites have advocated two approaches. One is something of a secessionist approach, which is part of this new this concept of greater Bahraini nationalism, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And religiously, they have many Saudi Shiites have embraced, declared their martial taqlid to Grand Ayatollah Shirazi, who was a prominent critic of the regime. Now, just to understand, let's take a step back to understand the importance of martyr taqlid and within 12-er Shia Islam, is just to give a very brief introduction to the concept of the marja and why this is important. Is I'm sure as everyone in this room is well aware, the seeds of the Sunni Shiite division go back to right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad as part of a succession crisis to succeed him, and Shiites unanimously. And one of the many things that sets them apart from Sunni Islam is the Shiite belief that Imam Ali ibn Abu Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, was the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Shiites, all Shiites worldwide believe that Ali was his rightful chosen successor, and they reject the caliphates of the first three successors to the Prophet Muhammad, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, as being illegitimate. But what's really unique about 12-er Shia Islam, the dominant form of Shia Islam in the world today, and this is very important because many commentators, scholars are aware of these differences, but for many political commentators often look at Shia Islam and they look at events transpiring, for example, in Yemen amongst Zaydi Shiites, or they assume that all Shiites exist as one and the same. It's very important to note which makes 12-er Shia Islam unique, apart from other forms of Shia Islam in the world, is the belief specifically in 12 imams, that is 12 divinely selected successors to the Prophet Muhammad, who were not just political successors, but were divinely chosen the successors at the beginning of creation. For Shiite theology, which has its seeds around roughly 800 AD, at the dawn of the Abbasid period, with the dawn of the Islamic Golden Age, when Islamic theology and jurisprudence was being elaborated on in great detail. 12 Shiite theologians, they said the 12 imams, together with the Prophet Muhammad and his daughter Fatima, constituted the 14 infallibles. At the start of the creation, God created them, and then God created the world, and really this whole earth and universe and everything that exists for no other reason than for the 14 infallibles to inhabit them. And the 12 imams, they possess a near omniscience and a perfect understanding of all matters theological and political. And a belief in Islam is not just belief in the La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. It's also belief in the imamate, which is why in many 12-er Shiite masjids or in literature, you'll often see Wa'ali, Wali Allah, and Ali is the vice-regent of God added to this. Now, this is important for several reasons, and has very important to understand this notion of the imamate in conception with contemporary internal debates within Shi'ism. and is that in the aftermath of the disappearance of the 12th Imam, who, according to the 12 Shiites, exists in the states of occultation, he exists in the states of being hidden from plain view, is this doctrine which was developed in this early period for roughly up until the rise of the Safavid dynasty in Iran in the 1500s. 12 Shiites specifically said, well, we're supposed to live in a state of what many scholars deem as quietism. There's no political activism, there's no rising until the reappearance of the 12th Imam to usher in this messianic age. And there's multiple hadiths in Usul al-Kafi, the main Shia hadiths, which caution against revolution and caution against following claimers to the imamate. Now, this sets 12 Shia Islam apart from, of course, Sunni Islam, who do not, of course, subscribe to these notions of the imamate as divinely chosen beings. For in addition, of course, 12 Shiites, we're probably all familiar with rituals such as Ashura, the commemoration of the death of Imam Hussein ibn Abu Talib, the death of Imam Ali. It also sets Shiite Muslims apart from other 12 or other Shiite groups, such as the Zaydis, dominant in Yemen, who conceptualize the imamate as simply just anyone who's blood related to the Prophet leading a revolution. And from the Ismailis, who have very similar theology to 12ers, but they still have a living, existing imam. Now, this, and of course, under this time period during these centuries, 12er Shiites were in various locations, existed in small insular communities, but developed a rigorous scholarly community and produced multiple scholarship and treatises on various issues. Now, 12er Shia Islam very much developed its, there was a bunch of revisions made by many scholars to 12er Shia Islam with the rise of Shah Ismail al-Safavid in the 1500s when he conquered modern-day Iran, parts of Iraq, Afghanistan, Bahrain, Azerbaijan, parts of Armenia, where he declared Shia Islam the state religion of Iran. He invited the 12er Shia ulama into Iran specifically to help legitimize his dynasty. And from this point on, 12er Shiite became somewhat divided, but largely they said, well, even if he's legitimate, he's here to pave the way for the coming of the 12th Imam. And because of these land grants, 12er Shiite clergy became a very powerful, even though they generally shied away from direct political power, 12er Shiite ulama, 12er Shiite clergy, they had a tremendous amount of social power, serving as essentially a feudal aristocracy. Now, later on, and it wasn't until, however much later, until the late 18th centuries, until even after the Safavid dynasty, did power generally more expand, when we saw the development of the concept of marja taqlid, when the dominant perspective, among Shiite clergy began specifically to say, well, the point of the scholar is to serve as your marja, your source of emulation, and you're supposed to engage in taqlid, or imitation, or emulation of these clergymen. So for most 12er Shiites, specifically those who belong to the Usuli school, is what it's called, they'll say, well, we have to give our allegiance to a living marja, a living ayatollah. The ayatollah has an opinion on almost literally anything. That includes how to open a door, whether or not you can play chess, whatever question at all, and you have to follow what this ayatollah says. Now, this was not embraced by all Shiites. There were Shiites who rejected this, and they are called the Akbari school, who have a more fundamentalist understanding of saying, well, no, we don't. The Akbaris weren't necessarily entirely anti-clerical, but the Akbaris doubled down, saying, well, we only accept Quran, Dawud, Hadiths. We're not going to give our marja, give our allegiance to a living ayatollah. But nonetheless, Akbaris are dominant in Bahrain. But for most of the Shia Islamic world, outside of Bahrain, that includes Iran, Iraq, and the parts of Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan, and India, and wherever, Indonesia, and these, obviously, most of those countries aren't majority Shiite, but where there are strong Shiite minorities, most 12er Shiites follow a marja, and most 12er Shiites give their allegiance specifically to a living ayatollah. Now, the rising of Ayatollah Khomeini and the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Khomeini brought in his new doctrine of guardianship of the jurist. That is to say, there's one marja, there's one jurist. I am in control of how things are done. I'm the supreme leader of Iran. Now, his doctrine proved to be very controversial. Many contemporary clergy rejected it, and most prominently in Iraq today, Grand Ayatollah Sistani remains a staunch critic of the doctrine of al-Faqih. But it's also important to note that many clerics under Ayatollah Khomeini who initially supported his views. Two notable examples of this include Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, his original successor, and another collaborator by the name of Ayatollah Muhammad Shirazi, who originally supported Khomeini's doctrine of creating this Islamic state, of creating this Islamic theocracy, later turned against them. In the case of Ayatollah Shirazi, Ayatollah Muhammad Shirazi later lost his title and fell into disgrace in the eyes of the IRI when Shirazi said, well, Khomeini's doctrine has become a dictatorship, and Shirazi advocated a decentralization, saying that our Islamic State should be ruled by a council of clerics. Now, tying this directly into the case of Saudi Arabia and Eastern Saudi Shiites, in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, 12 Shiite Muslims took this opportunity to engage in public protests. They felt a great deal of inspiration from the Iranian Revolution, a great deal of inspiration, saying, well, we're going to reclaim our rights. Because now tying this back to Saudi Arabia, we heard in this room not too long ago, of course, for centuries, the Saudi state, well, Saudi Arabia as an Arab country was formed in the early 1900s. But when it was, Saudi Arabia promotes the doctrine of Salafism or Wahhabism, which of course draws from older and Sunni critics' criticisms of Shia Islam. And for years, the Saudi state, once they conquered the eastern province, Saudi Arabia, the government has said Shiites cannot publicly mourn Hussein on Ashura. These public Shiite practices are banned. And Shiite textbooks, going back to the grade school level, commonly denounced Shiite Islam as being mushrik, which means polytheism, and denounced Shiites as being majus or Zoroastrianism, accused Saudi Shiites of being Persian settlers who have settled and invaded Saudi Arabia. And routinely, Saudis have faced routine arrests by the religious police and a great crackdown. And these protests, inspired by 79, led to an instability in Saudi Arabia, which Saudi Arabia was able to suppress. There were some revolutionaries, some groups who, inspired by Khomeini, later Khomeini, called Hizbullah Hijaz, who took credit for some acts of violence against the Saudi state and against some Americans forces stationed in Saudi Arabia. However, this led to a great deal of unrest, a great string of protests and of crackdowns. And in the early 2000s, of course, in the mid-2000s, with the execution of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, this also led to a rise in persecutions of the Shiite Saudi community, because the perception, even though Saddam was a secular Ba'athist, and Saddam, of course, had, never got along with Saudi Arabia up any stretch of imagination, a popular view within the wider Arab Sunni world with the executions of Saddam was that, well, the Shiites have killed a Sunni, now the Shiites are running loose, and this led to a string of intense persecution within Saudi Arabia of the Shiite community. Now, the Shiite community world in Saudi Arabia have developed a couple of interesting, unique approaches to claim their identity and stand up for their rights against persecution. One idea popular is gaining traction amongst many Shiite Saudi writers has been promoting this nationalist mytho-history of a greater Bahrain, saying originally our brothers and sisters in Bahrain, we were united on the eastern province with our Shiite brothers in Bahrain, and drawing on, using almost racialized terminology, Shiite writers have said, well, we Eastern Saudis, we are civilized. But these savages from Najd, these desert bandits, these Bedouin desert bandits who are not civilized, came and captured us and have occupied us. So we advocate the secession of Eastern Saudi Arabia from Saudi Arabia and the overthrow of the Bahraini monarchy. and the creation of a greater Bahraini state. Now, this appears to have died down in recent years, even though there was actually a State Department memo supporting it in the early 2000s. There doesn't appear to be much support for it now in the current times. It appears now that Saudi Shiites have worked, are now more willing to work within the confines of other protesters in Saudi government who has opened up a path to liberalization. We heard about earlier in this room from scholars like Dr. Kolbunzel to assert their rights within a greater Saudi state. But what's really also most interesting, and of course I wish I could go into this more, but I'm at actually right now about the 1 minute cutoff, is that many Saudi Shiites have publicly rejected giving a marja to their allegiance to the Marja Khamenei. Polls have shown that many Shiite Saudis publicly give their allegiance to Grand Ayatollah Sistani within Iraq, but even greater of them have given their allegiance to Grand Ayatollah Shirazi. For Ayatollah Shirazi, who the Shirazi Marja'iyya, which remains today, is outspoken in its criticism of Khamenei and the IRI. You read Shirazi materials, you go to Shirazi websites, they'll insist that in no way, shape, or form is the Islamic Republic of Iran a legitimate expression of an Islamic state, even though they advocate their forms of Sharia. Now, on that note, because I do believe I probably just hit the limit, I'm going to say thank you all again for attending. I look forward to your Q&A. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker for this panel today is Ilan Zalayat, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Historical Studies at Aviv University. I have to say, Brandon Friedman and myself are lucky to be the advisors, and he's also been a research fellow at the Institute of National Security Studies and the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University. And he will speak today about Karbala of the Gulf, the revolutionary thought of Hadi al-Mudarrisi and the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain. So, Ilan.
Hi, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to speak here today. My study discussed the philosophy of the Shia scholar Hadi al-Mudarrisi and his organization, the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, in Arabic, al-Jabha al-Islamiyya lil-Tahrir al-Bahrain, in which I'll refer to in short as the IFLB. The IFLB was established in Iran in 1980 by Shia Islamists who were deported from Bahrain following the support of the Iranian Revolution. For about a decade, they tried to stimulate a similar revolution in Bahrain to overthrow the monarchy and replace it with an Islamic republic. Previous studies haven't distinguished al-Mudarrisi and his group from the broader Shia politics in Bahrain and the region. I argue the distinction merits attention, since despite failing to bring about revolution, al-Mudarrisi was the first alim to challenge the political passivity of Bahrain Shia leadership, even though he was foreign and young and relatively young. The IFLB staged the first coup attempt in Bahrain in 1981, and also the group had a lasting impact on the whole opposition movement in Bahrain to this day, shifting it into a nationalistic and Islamic. The research question is how al-Mudarrisi and the IFLB accommodated the far-reaching agenda of Islamic revolution to the cautious and conservative Bahraini Shia community. To answer this, the study examined for the first time the textual material they have published using intellectual history analysis. How do I shift it front? Yeah, okay. Start with some historical background. Al-Mudarrisi was born in Karbala, Iraq in 1946 to a family of Iranian origin. He grew up on the Shia political activism of his uncle, Ayatollah Muhammad al-Shirazi, who challenged the passive orthodoxy of the Shia religious establishment in Najaf. After being qualified as an alim, al-Mudarrisi moved to Bahrain in the 70s to spread the teaching of al-Shirazi among the local Shia community. Bahrain Shia made in the time about half of the 200,000 citizens of the small Gulf island country, and they were long politically, economically, and marginalized, and also stigmatized by the Sunni al-Khalifa ruling dynasty. At the very same time that al-Mudarrisi stayed in Bahrain, there were some key developments that particularly steered the Shia against the government. First, the Amir dissolved the first parliament established after only 2 years. Second, the 1973 oil boom widened socioeconomic gap against the Shia. And finally, the 1979 Iran Revolution served as inspiration for Bahrain Shia. While the Bahraini Shia ulama establishment collaborated with the government and opposed protest, al-Mudarrisi seized the opportunity and incited massive Shia demonstration. This brought him recognition and led to his deportation from Bahrain with a circle of followers, which became the IFLB. In the first part of the analysis, I outlined the foundation of al-Mudarrisi Islamic doctrine, which underlaid the IFLB agenda. I found that it's built upon several concepts for modern Islamic thinking that al-Mudarrisi brought into Bahrain Shia discourse for the first time. First is the activist interpretation of Shiism, which holds that the revolution of Hussein bin Ali didn't end with his defeat in the Battle of Karbala in the 7th century, but should persist wherever justice prevails, leading by the ulama as the placeholder of the imam. This is a departure of the Orthodox Shia approach, which leaves this duty to God until the return of the imam. Within this tendency, al-Mudarrisi aligned himself with the convention that the Islamic law must be imposed on all state systems, if needed, by militant jihad. He is inspired in this aspect by his mentor al-Shirazi and his model for revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, but interestingly, also by some modern Sunni Islamism, particularly the theory of modern Jahiliyyah by Sayyid Qutb. The term Jahiliyyah originally referred to the pre-Islamic area of Arabia and the immorality that prevailed in this time. Sayyid Qutb redefined Jahiliyyah as a state of Muslim society nowadays, since the stray for proper Islam. Al-Mudarrisi, in turn, add another refinement to this concept, saying that Jahiliyyah is found today in the Arab tribal society, since the social structure preserved the uncivilized conduct of the Jahiliyyah era. This definition fit Bahrain well, since, like all Gulf monarchies, Bahrain is governed by a tribal dynasty that shaped its regime according to the traditional tribal structure. Ultimately, al-Mudarrisi used his definition of Jahiliyyah to denounce the Al-Khalifa regime as heretical rulership, thus declaring jihad against it. The second section explored the response of al-Mudarrisi and the IFLB to the fact that no popular revolution developed in Bahrain following the Iran Revolution and their own coup attempt. Historical studies indicate that Bahrain Shia reject the revolution largely due to material benefits that the modernization of Bahrain through the oil revenue provide them, like employment, education, and healthcare, which led the Shia to prefer the status quo over political risks. Indeed, the writing of al-Mudarrisi and the IFLB address the modern socio-political order in Bahrain by drawing a mystical analogy to the Battle of Karbala, the formative tragedy of Shi'ism, using the slogan Karbala of the Gulf. You can see the slogan here, Karbala al-Halij. In this analogy, the Al-Khalifa is the embodiment of Yazid ibn Muawiyah, Hussein's rival in Karbala, who's considered in Shi'ism as the ultimate evil. The Bahrainis therefore face the same choices as the Muslim at Karbala. First, to support the unjust rule, like the Umayyads do, not to choose and let the evil win, or to choose the right path of revolution, willing to sacrifice as Hussein did. Invoking the Shia belief in ikhtiyar, man's ability to choose between right and wrong, al-Mudarrisi states that one can simply not excuse on the judgment day, choosing different path than Imam Hussein did. Further, the IFLB compared the new benefits the government provided to the citizens in Bahrain to the temptation and manipulation that Yazid used to convince the Muslim not to join Imam Hussein in Karbala. The group explained the modernization of Bahrain involved the influence of the country by non-Muslim practice, among those racist discrimination. Therefore, the sectarian discrimination the Shia endure in Bahrain, according to the IFLB, is fueled by those modern service that the Shia enjoy. Lastly, al-Mudarrisi attacks anyone who work or cooperate with the Al-Khalifa regime, saying they made a deal with Yazid. Although it wasn't stated explicitly, he seems to refer to the Shia elite of ulama and notable family who were close to the Al-Khalifa and stood against the IFLB. This is striking since, for Shia, the accusation of siding with Yazid is perhaps the strongest condemnation can be. Another theme that was identified in the analysis was the creation of Bahraini nationalism. In this analysis, the al-Khalifa regime involved the influence of the country by non-Muslim practice, among those racist discrimination. Therefore, the sectarian discrimination the Shia endure in Bahrain, according to the IFLB, is fueled by those modern service that the Shia enjoy. Lastly, al-Mudarrisi attacks anyone who work or cooperate with the Al-Khalifa regime, saying they made a deal with Yazid. This is striking since, for Shia, the accusation of siding with Yazid is perhaps the strongest condemnation can be. It addressed to the legitimacy problem of the IFLB to speak for Bahrain. Al-Mudarrisi himself, as noted, isn't Bahraini, and the rest of the leadership of the group happened to be from the Ajami community, a minority within the Shia community of people of Iranian origin. Also, being sponsored by the Iranian regime, the IFLB must had asserted that his loyalty lay in Bahrain. Therefore, the group followed the pattern of many minorities in the Arab world by promoting the concept of a monolithic territorial nation which concealed their distinctiveness. Significantly, they are the first to introduce the concept of single-state nationalism to the political discourse in Bahrain and possibly anywhere in the Gulf states, where the state identities center around the ruling families. As common with national movement, the IFLB frame it as an anti-colonial struggle. They ignore Bahrain independence from the British in 1971, stating that the country had been an occupied colony ever since the Khalifa arrived from the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th century. Essentially, this narrative frames the long-standing alienation of the Bahrain Shia from the Al-Khalifa family as a national conflict. To highlight why the Al-Khalifa is considered as a foreign occupier and not authentic Bahrainis, the IFLB argued that they treat Bahrain as their own personal possession rather than serving its people. Now, this argument generally echoes a common sentiment among Bahrain Shia. However, the IFLB gives this sentiment a religious nature. It states that tribespeople, like the Al-Khalifa, have a Jahiliyyah mentality that cannot understand loyalty to a land or its people, but only seek the benefit of the tribe. It even takes it further and asserts that all the tribes who settle in Bahrain are not part of the Bahraini nation for the same reason. Now, given that in modern Bahrain, the tribal population largely overlaps with the Sunni population, the IFLB delicately communicates here that the Shia are the only real Bahrainis. Strikingly, the IFLB doesn't mention the word Arab in its portrayal of the Bahraini nation, and even said the Gulf rather than the Arab Gulf, as common in the Arab Gulf states, to dissociate Bahrain as much as possible from the sphere of the Arabian Peninsula. Lastly, the IFLB closely ties Bahrain's struggle for national liberation to universal spread of rightful Islamic order, leaving an obvious dissonance between Bahraini nationalism and Islamic universalism. Al-Mudarrisi somewhat clarified this contradiction in an interview in which he put it simply, "We know the geographical borders are designed to divide, but we don't question whether to eliminate the nationalities." So we can conclude that the IFLB used the modern concept of a Bahraini nation state as an expedient framework for promoting the religious agenda. This practice aligned with the work of Sami Zubaydah, who argued that Islamic fundamentalist movements have adapted since the 70s to the regular politics of the respective country by shaping their allegedly ancient ideas and aspirations according to some of the assumptions of the modern nation state. In conclusion, al-Mudarrisi and the IFLB blended intense Shia activism, Sunni fundamentalism, and modern nationalism in a way that turns the idea of Islamic revolution specifically appealing to Bahrain Shia. First, they frame Bahrain inequalities as a religious misconduct that only Islam can fix, and as cosmic issues that overcome any rational logic against revolution. Second, al-Mudarrisi redefinition of the concept of Jahiliyyah reversed the sectarian hierarchy in Bahrain, offering the Shia an alternative Bahrain in which they are superior to the Sunnis in their status. Lastly, to reassure its audience that its agenda doesn't go against patriotism to Bahrain, the IFLB entirely molded the Islamic revolution into a nation-building project. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilan, and for being keeping the strict restraint on time. I will say a few words. It's difficult to find common features among four very interesting papers on different Shia communities in the Arab world. I think one thing is common among all of them. All of them reject the Iranian perception of Wilayat al-Faqih. Maybe this is the only thing that brings them in common, that they don't accept Khomeini's.
No, I have to disagree with this. I mean, in the sense that, whereas the other presentations really did emphasize other Shia religious authorities, perhaps, but with the people of al-Fua get afraid of it. I mean, there is a great affection for Iran and Hezbollah, and
So you preempted my question, question which I wanted to raise, but I accept your correction.
Yeah.
So, except for these two villages, I would say the Shia communities in the Gulf. The interesting phenomenon is that they reject the Iranian perception. Again, what you refer to is a question which I intended to ask. Of course, there's another important factor is that, again, what Ilan mentioned from citing Sam Zubaydah is that all of them accept the borders of the different states. That is, we have accept the development of, as you can say, state Shiism or different Shia communities which adopted, incorporated national identities or, let's say, the territorial identities of the state.
Yeah.
Another, of course, important phenomenon is the politicization of sectarianism. That is, what made two Shia villages in Syria, which say have no deep ideological, let's say, never ideological centers or centers for learning, what transformed them into, when you said before there were good relations with the Sunnis, all of a sudden becoming separation. The same thing, of course, in Iraq, where the politicization of the Shia took place in the late 1950s, and of course the Shias in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia. This one phenomenon, this is, you can say, politicization of sectarianism in the Middle East, and Shia communities, I would say all of them in the late 1950s, and again, another major step is the Iran revolution. I would also I would make some very short comments to some of the points you made. Again, as I said, you preempted my question because what I intended to ask you was indeed, did these Shias communities in two remote villages, did they have any connection with the larger centers of Shia learning? No. First I want to, and then now regarding Rachel's paper, again, a comment I would say is that you discussed, analyzed the fight over memory in Iraq, and I'm a great believer that what gives a community a sense of community is memory, and the fact that there's a continued fight over memory in Iraq shows the fragmentation of, I would say, Iraqi identity, and within it, of Shia identity with Iraq, which raises the question, why is the Shia community in Iraq so fragmented? Why the Sunnis and Shias are fragmented, it's easy to explain. Why the Shias are so fragmented is a phenomenon. Is it only personal or is there something else? Regarding Alexander's paper, again, if you can say to what extent is the support for Shia secessionism, how widespread it is. Is it a question of few intellectuals? Does it encompasses broader groups or publics? And again, for Ilan's interesting paper, is again, the interesting phenomenon is that the Shia Bahrainis, again, they reject the Iranian model, but they do follow a cleric from Iraq who is of Iranian origins. Again, the question is, why is it, what brings it together? These are my short questions and comments. Before you answer me, if you have any questions from the audience, we'll welcome. If not, you... Okay, so...
Yeah. So I didn't have time to get into it in the presentation because of time constraint, but the main connection actually between the villages of al-Fua and Kafariya and outside learning is a cleric called the Sayyid Abdullah Nizam, who is based in Damascus. He is, he has links to Iranians and Hezbollah. And he, for example, actually one link, again, I didn't have time to get into it in the presentation, but it was there, was this scouting association he runs called Kashaf al-Wilaya Scouting Association. And Abdullah Nizam was actually running the supply commission that would coordinate with the crisis management committee in al-Fua and Kafariya.
This is during the Civil War.
But the link existed before. The link between Abdullah Nizam and the two villages existed before the Civil War as well. I would say one thing actually that might tie in with Ilan's interesting discussion actually is that, although the Shia might say they love Hassan Nasrallah and Khamenei, they still nonetheless accept Syria as a nation state and Syria as a political order that is dominated by the Ba'ath Party and the Assad family. So, I think that maybe actually does go back to your earlier observation too, that there's still this recognition and respect for the idea of the nation state, whatever they say about Wilayat and Baqir.
So why are Shias so fragmented in Iraq is a very good question. I would just point to two factors. I think one of the issues where there's divergence is over the acceptable amount of Iranian influence in Iraq. I think that there's divergences on that. And then the other factor that I see is, for the most part, boils down to competition for material sources. And 2003 brought new forms of competition, the ballot box and more, fighting over pieces of the pie. So, I mean, that's how I see it. I don't actually see the ideological and theological differences as necessarily the driving factor.
Well, thank you for your question, Dr. Bach. Is it, it's funny, I guess your question on the paper about support for Eastern secessionism. I haven't. I mean, the research that I did, I couldn't find much advocacy for it or support from it in the last ever since the aughts. What I found is, for a lot of the material written about the aughts or during the aughts in the 2000s, there seemed to be more discussions of it. Like Fahad in his book Foreigner's Gift actually alludes to this State Department plan I mentioned to split Saudi Arabia in half. I think it was part of the goal was concern for Saudi Arabia financing Salafism. They thought, well, great, we can break the power of the Salafi monopoly by creating a Shiite state here in the east and having them control the oil. And another couple other books, one of the Transnational Shiite Networks, a recent book that I mentioned, went into detail about this consecrated Bahraini identity. Now, in terms of its current prevalence, I mean, I haven't seen much of it. I'm sure it's probably still there. I was talking. It's funny. I was speaking earlier at the lunch a few hours ago about Texas secessionism. About there's no shortage of Texans who want to separate from the United States. That's still philosophy. And I was speaking with someone not too long ago about a roommate I had for about 5 years from Tabriz, who said that the dominant opinion among Azeris, both in Iran and Azerbaijan, was to reunify but overthrow the IRI and restore the Qajar monarchy. And he says that, Qajar restorationism is the way of the future. Now, I haven't really found any evidence for that, but at least I know there's one Qajar monarchist who exists. So, I mean, any kind of idea, no matter how out there in politics or religion, you can find someone who will believe in it. Yeah, general rule.
Okay, I think generally the relationship between Bahrain and Iran are quite complicated. Iran controlled Bahrain until the Al-Khalifa was in the 18th century. Iran continued to claim that Bahrain belonged to it. After the revolution, this claim kind of resurfaced again. And the Bahraini regime is either genuinely afraid that the Shia will join Iran or just use it as an excuse to suppress the opposition. I guess both are true, correct? So the Shia constantly need to prove that they're not pro-Iran and constantly need to prove that the stigma is wrong. And this was a massive demonstration. It was after the Iran Revolution, quite anomaly. The quite anomaly to the Shia behavior of not showing identification with Iran. Al-Mudarrisi tried to play on this anomaly until it was faded. But even the IFLB, which is the most pro-Iranian element that was in Bahrain, even they didn't adhere Khomeini as a martyr. They had adhere Shirazi. So yes, there's always this fine line that as much as we support and adhere Iran, even today the leadership of the Shia opposition sit in Iran, Issa Qasem. We are not Iran. We are not adhere to Khomeini. We have to put some line to cross here to not take too much heat on them in Bahrain.